Hello and welcome to this second episode of the Humane Language Podcast, which features conversations about language, communication, and humane connection. Today, I'm speaking to Jamie Brown, a writer, linguist, and localization consultant based in the UK. Very excited to talk to Jamie today about his background in linguistics, his love for all things writing and public speaking, and I'm particularly looking forward to delving into a topic we're both passionate about, using language as a force for good. So hello and welcome, Jamie.
Hi, Anya. Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, I'm very, very honored. So
Well,
just for a little bit of context, I wanted, the listeners to know that we met a few years ago when we were both working in the language industry. I was running a translation company at the time, and you were the Chief Language Services Officer at What Three Words. So just to get us started, are you happy maybe to share a few words about what Three Words is and kind of your role there and how you used your linguistic background for building a truly international product?
Yeah, of course. I'd be really happy to. So, What Three Words was started in 2013 by some people in the UK. And basically, in a nutshell, through a lot of different experiences in their lives and in the lives of others, they realised that what the world really needed was a human-focused way to talk extremely precisely about location. So location of you, location of buildings, location of absolutely anything you want. We've got street addresses, which can be good to talk about where your house is. But they don't cover every single place that you might be in the world, and you might need somebody to be able to navigate to easily. We have GPS coordinates or lat-long coordinates, but those aren't particularly human-friendly. Big strings of numbers and letters, and it's really easy to get them muddled up or to say them to somebody wrongly, and then they just type in one number wrong, and actually that's a completely different part of the world to where you were trying to direct them to. So what they came up with, absolutely ingenious idea, was to divide the entire world into 3-metre squares. So there's about 57 trillion 3-metre by 3-metre squares on the surface of the globe. And to each one, they assigned a completely unique 3-word code or 3-word address. Basically, a way of talking about that particular square. So it could be the square that I'm sitting in right now in the UK, could be the square where you are in Portugal, could be in the middle of the Amazon rainforest, any single square. And that's the only square in the world that has that specific code. So, for example, the front door of my house, the 3 words that it has is puff, twin, ties. And that's the only one. That's the only puff twin ties that there is.
Yeah.
So if you've got the What Three Words app, you can type in those words and it'll take you exactly to my front door.
Amazing.
Which is really useful, particularly if I live in a remote area. It's useful for the postman to be able to type it in to find exactly where it is, because, the UK is a developed country with great street addressing, but even then, there are street addresses or postcodes that don't actually get you to the front door of where you're trying to deliver the parcel.
Oh yeah, and for full disclosure, I love What Three Words, and here in Portugal, I just wish that the postal service would, use What Three Words address, because our address, we live sort of just outside a village, and it's this sort of area has a name that no one's ever heard of. The only reference to it is like a hand-painted sign on someone's tree as you drive past through that particular part of the edge of the village. And normally, the post people never find us, and I just wish they would use what 3 words address, because that's it. You can't really send, like, you need delivery drivers, let's say WhatsApp, so you then can then send them your location on WhatsApp, for example. That's the only way we can do it. Or with DHL, after they miss 5 attempts, you can finally call them and then give them your actual Google coordinates, which is just like,
Literally.
it's insane, and it's very easy to get wrong, and it's not user friendly. So the what 3 words address, I think, is such an ingenious idea. It seems so simple, and people, I think sometimes people go, oh yeah, but you could do this, you could do this. It's like, yeah, you could, but this is such a much easier way, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. The whole point of what 3 words address, like I said, is that it's human friendly. So you can get down to that precision of 3 meters by just 3 words that are easy to remember. They're easy to tell the DHL driver over the phone. If you're speaking to them, you can say, "Oh, just type puff twin ties into the What
Yeah,
3 Words app." On that topic, it's also particularly useful. And lots of countries in the world are now using it in this way for emergency services. So you have a car crash on an unfamiliar road, and previously you would have rung, in the UK, 999, but the emergency telephone number where you are, and be speaking to the call handler, and you're saying, well, I'm on this road and it's dark and it's raining and I can see some trees, and I think I passed the village of XYZ a few miles ago, but I don't really know where I am. Like, this isn't part
yeah,
of the world that's familiar to me. In the UK, the call handler is now quite likely to say, um, do you have the What 3 Words app? Can you get it? Can you tell me the 3 words? And then they'll be able to send the ambulance to that exact 3
yeah,
meter spot, which is, life changing in many, many situations.
yeah.
Um,
Incredible.
so yeah, so basically, for whatever reason you want, is it DHL driver? Is it emergency services? Is it you're having a picnic in a massive park and you want to tell your friends exactly where you are because that's the easiest way to direct them um, to the middle of the park? You
Mm.
know, all those kinds of things. You're going surfing tomorrow morning on a particular beach that you love. You happen to know where the great waves are, so you want to tell your friends, um, this is where I'm going to be at 9 a.m. Let's meet there.
Mm.
Places that don't have an address or don't have a street address have a What 3 Words address instead. And
Yeah,
like I said, the entire world is already mapped out with these 57 trillion squares, and they already have a unique 3 word code for every single one.
you say
Um,
57 trillion?
57 trillion, yeah, isn't
That's
that crazy?
insane. I'm just thinking, like, in my head, I'm forwarding to the point where you tell us how you then localize this product. Like, that's an insane amount of, like, words.
So the trick is you don't, or me as a, you know, product maker, I guess, we
Mm.
don't go to every single square, choose 3 words to put in it, and then move to the next one. Doing
Okay.
that 57 trillion times would be time consuming.
That's what I was thinking. Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
So there must be a smarter way to put
there's a
these
smarter way
together.
of doing it, Anya, there is. Um, Basically, how it works is, so let's take English as an example. We make a big list of words in English. It's tens of thousands, but it's not more words than people have in their vocabulary. Um, we make a list. There's lots of reasons why a word would be in that list, or reasons why we might want to exclude that word from our list.
Hmm.
So, for example, we make an effort to make the product user friendly, so we don't have words that are particularly offensive or confusing or have regional spellings like the word colour in the UK and the USA, that sort of thing. We try
Mm.
not to have words like that. But once we're happy with this list of words, that we've worked with native speakers and lots of people that are representative of that language community. We then basically pop that into the algorithm, and the algorithm then generates unique three-word addresses in all combinations for the 57 trillion squares. So the time-consuming bit is creating that list of words, and then actually at the click of a button, the algorithm then assigns all those words all around the world so that every single square is completely unique. So there's only one puff twin ties, and it's on my front door.
Okay, so I guess this is something you have to get right one time, because I guess once you press that button, you can't then say 6 months later, oh, there's a square here that, you know, it doesn't really work with the letter combination. So maybe the words next to each other are almost identical. And so it's a bit, oh, let's just do that again. You can't do that, right? You have to build it and be really confident that it's going to be right once you've got that word list. Once you press the button, I guess you can't go back and then change it, because an address is an address, right? It's never going to change.
Yeah, exactly. You know, once a user has used the What Three Words app to find the What Three Words address for their front door, and they've painted it on the front of their house, and they've printed the business cards, and they've told all their friends, you don't want to then tinker with those three words and say, oh, actually, we didn't really love word 2, so we've changed that a bit and we've moved the order around. You know, people would start to get quite annoyed with the company for doing that. So you're absolutely right. V1 is the only version, and it just, you know, that provides users of What Three Words with that confidence and the security that, you know, their address isn't going to change and that it's always going to be there.
Yeah. And besides things like, okay, maybe words being inappropriate or culturally, you know, a bit iffy, or maybe different spellings, are there any other linguistic aspects that you consider when you build those lists?
Yeah, sure. So there's, you know, the sort of more the human-facing things, I guess. So stuff like, is this word offensive? Is it particularly negative? Is it the kind of word that I would have a sort of negative reaction to? Because, you know, at the end of the day, these are random words, right? You know, as humans, we understand that they're random words and they're not intended to describe the location that they've been assigned to. But also, if you were using What Three Words for the first time and you looked at your front door and the 3 words that you found there was sort of dishonest criminals here, you know, that would be something that would be hard to get over, even though rationally you know that that What Three Words isn't trying to describe you as being a criminal. You just wouldn't want to print that on your business card, right?
Yeah, true.
So there's stuff like that. There's also things, you know, we don't want a What Three Words address to look like a street address. So stuff like numbers and proper nouns and names of towns and stuff like that, you know, you won't find words like that in a What Three Words address. So it's more sort of those dictionary words that we're looking for. And then there's the sort of maybe slightly more behind the scenes linguistic element. So like I said, so English, as an example, has regional variations of the language that don't always agree on the spelling of the word. So if I rang you up and said, hey, Anya, come over to my house. It's at colour, favourite, recognise. I don't want you to have to question, oh, is that colour with a U? Is it recognise with an S? So we try to remove words like that have that sort of spelling ambiguity for people that speak the language, regardless of who you are, right? So, you know, we're trying to create an inclusive product that works whatever your background, wherever in the world you live, whatever regional variation of a language you speak. So we would work with British people and American people and lots of other English speaking people around the world to
Mm.
curate a list of words that works for everybody, regardless of who you
Okay.
are, what sort of English you speak. English is actually an example of a language that has lots and lots of homophones.
Mm-hmm.
Homophones being words that, so pairs of words, maybe that sound the same when you say them out loud,
Mm.
but have two different spellings depending on their
Yeah.
meaning. So a little bit like the colour and collar example, but these are actually completely unrelated semantically. So words like made, which would be MADE for the past tense of make,
Yeah.
or somebody who um, did the cleaning at the big house would
Yeah.
be MAID made. So
Gotcha.
again, saying to you, come and meet me at made great find.
Mm.
I don't want you to have to question me like, which made do I mean, which great do I mean, which find is it, in order to be able to type them in correctly.
Wow. So
So we
how do
make it,
you figure that out? Like, how do you figure out in English? Okay, you know English, so you could look at the word list, and I guess would you sort it alphabetically and then look at what looks similar, or how do you figure out the homonym in your word list?
I mean, that's one good way, but English has such crazy spelling rules that you can't even, you know, um, the word colonel,
Mm.
um, like the rank in the army begins with a C, but the middle of a nut begins with a K.
So
so,
true.
so you
So
can't.
that's not the best way to do it then.
I mean, it's one way to do it,
Yeah.
um, but essentially what we do, and a really crucial part of what through words in general, but particularly I would say the language element of what through words is I often describe it as being technology that's powered by humans.
Beautiful.
And actually, what we don't do is find a list of words online, pop it into the algorithm, and cross our fingers. Like that would be, particularly going back to the V1 is the only version.
Yeah.
Um, that is not how we would conduct ourselves. So actually, what we do in English and in every other subsequent language that we've localized what the words into is we we engage a big team of native speakers of that language. So,
Hmm.
like I said before, we're looking for a fair representation of that particular language community. So we're looking for different ages, different backgrounds, different language use, professional linguists, amateur language enthusiasts, uh, people from every part of the world or part of the country that speak that language to get a real sort of understanding of all the different ways in which people use language. And
Mm.
obviously, we're never going to represent an entire language community with the numbers of people that we're able to have on a project. But we're trying to get as diverse a group of people as we can,
Yeah.
um, to give us that understanding of, oh, but in the USA, Marvelous only has one L.
No problem.
Um, and so homophones differ from the UK to the US, or even within
Mm.
the UK. Um, so in the UK, for example, look and luck, they're not homophones to me from the south of England, but to
Mm.
somebody
Mm.
from the north of England, they would be pronounced the same way. So we're really trying to represent as best we can all the speakers that might be using what few words.
Really, really interesting.
Uh,
And I love that it's so inclusive and not just for, super educated people, but to bring it down for everyone. So it's really useful. And Yeah, especially in situations where you were talking about maybe saving lives, you're calling an ambulance and you're already stressed. So it has to be really simple, and adrenaline is pumping. So the homophone example is perfect, because if you're talking to a call handler with the emergency services and they then have so how do you spell maid, which one is it? So yeah, I guess
Yeah.
it's super important to make it as efficient as possible.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
And also, that's the reason why we don't just build it with professional linguists, because
Mm,
everybody, depending on their background or their job or their education, they have a different vocabulary.
mm,
And if we just had professional linguists that were curating the word list, the
yeah,
kinds of words that we use, to me, the word homophone is a word that I use every day.
yeah.
But lots of people have no idea what that is, and
Mm.
would stumble over it if they were, like you say, in a stressful emergency services situation and trying to communicate with the call handler. If it's not a familiar word, then it's going to add that extra level of stress.
Yeah,
So it's really
absolutely.
important that we get a real representation of that community of speakers, but also product users, I guess.
Yeah. And how many languages can you use what three words in today?
Right now, as of today, 61 languages and counting,
That's insane.
which is really cool. It is really cool. That is quite a lot of the last 10 years of my life have been have been recreating that original English word list into
Yeah.
lots of other languages in the world, because you know I was really, really lucky. I joined a startup in the UK 12 no 11 years ago now,
Mm.
as a linguist, and a localization professional, but also an academic. Like,
Yeah.
research is my passion. Um, and what Three Words recognized right from the very beginning of the company being a thing, that they had this ambition to go global, to revolutionize the way that everybody spoke about addresses and location, not just English speakers. There's a
Yeah.
lot of English speakers in the world, but there's a lot more people in the world that aren't English speakers. And they wanted to make sure that What Three Words as a product was accessible to as many people as possible.
Yeah. And
Um,
what I love about that is actually, from a commercial perspective, I imagine that was quite a hard sell if if what three words maybe had investors, or, because typically you'll go into your fix or things languages, right? French, German,
yeah,
Italian, Spanish, all the ones that are commercially viable, where you feel like you might have the adoption of the product. And then, if people are feeling generous, they'll then go into other languages of the world. But to build that into the core of the product, to be truly international, I think it's a really cool thing to do.
it is incredible. And, I'm eternally grateful to the founders for being those people who recognized right from the beginning how important language and localization and communication is
Mm.
globally. And, it's really paid off for them, because I think What Few Words is such a universal product. It's useful in so many ways to so many people,
Mm.
so many use cases that aren't just confined to the UK or to English speaking communities.
Yeah.
Um, so when, as as has happened, uh, the National Postal Service in Cambodia say, "Oh, we want to integrate What Three Words," we can say, "That's great," and you can, because we have a Khmer language version of What Three Words, and
Yeah.
they quite often, I imagine, I'm not in those meetings, but I imagine quite often they're pleasantly surprised that we've already
Yeah.
thought of localizing the product into those sorts of languages,
Mm.
and make those commercial opportunities easier, because at the end of the day, it is a company and there has to be a commercial reason for doing these things like localizing into all those 61 languages.
Yeah.
But there's a real clear use case as to why we would do all of that work. It's
Yeah.
to help commercial opportunities like a national postal service integration in, the majority of the countries in the world where English isn't one of the national languages.
Yeah. I mean, I imagine, because your background is in linguistics, that doing that kind of job must have been like a boy in the sweet shop every single day, because so essentially you learned new stuff, I imagine, about 60 languages, right? Like you must
Absolutely,
have picked up so much.
absolutely constantly. I mean, I've this sounds a bit schmaltzy, but I have lost count of the number of times that I've said, this job is the perfect job for a linguist who is
Mm,
interested in research. Like
yeah.
you get to spend your life finding out stuff about languages and applying it and seeing the application of your research, time and time again. So anytime anybody shares a What Three Words address that isn't in English, I think
Yeah.
that's the application of my research. That's really
It's,
cool.
I mean, you must be so proud, honestly.
Yeah,
Yeah,
okay. Yeah,
it's
yeah,
okay. You're allowed to be. You're allowed to take some credit as well.
yeah. Um, because I guess what we're alluding to here is that localizing What Few Words into other languages is a research project. It isn't a straightforward translation project.
Hmm.
Because if we go back to that list of English words, you can't, as any linguist or non-linguist really will know, you can't neatly translate every word from that English word list into one single word in every other language of the world
Yeah,
and still guarantee that it isn't going to be offensive to speakers to that language community or that cultural community. It isn't going to accidentally become a homophone when you translate it into another
yeah,
language. It isn't going to, stay as one word. Like the word snowman is in the English word list, but bonhomme de neige in French is three words already in itself.
yeah,
So how's that going to work in the context of a what three words address?
yeah.
Um,
Super interesting.
yeah, so for that reason, um, every time you localize what three words into a new language, what you're actually doing is constructing that list of words
Hmm.
again from the ground up, from scratch in that new language.
Yeah,
Um, and that then gives you the opportunity to go back to basics and ask yourself and ask that team of native speakers as well the question, how do we make this as user friendly as possible for speakers of this language? We're not constrained by the source text. You know,
yeah,
we have to create something that looks like the source. It is a list of the same number of words,
yeah,
but actually there, I think the similarity ends.
yeah,
You have that opportunity to do exactly what you want for that particular language to make it the best product you possibly can. It's a linguist and a researcher's dream.
yeah, absolutely. And I think it's not translation, it's not even cultural adaptation. You kind of start from scratch with every country. And you must, because like I know language and culture are so intrinsically linked. I guess you must have picked up a lot of knowledge about cultural differences from one language to another, one country to another, as well as part of learning, getting, I guess, getting involved in the language at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many things. I should have written them all down while I was doing it, but we were too busy at the time. Like talking about language as culture and the things that particular communities find offensive or
Mm.
negative, or not only that, maybe just culturally sensitive, stuff that is absolutely okay in one community but isn't okay in another community,
Mm.
or stuff that holds a particular religious significance to a group of people,
Yeah.
um, or just one thing for some examples. So you find out all kinds of things. So I was working with Brazilian Portuguese speakers, um, and they were perfectly fine with putting the verb to sweat into the word list. And, I was being very British about it and trying not to, you know, try not to cause a scene. Um, but I was like, sweat, is that a bit gross? Like, would you mind that, in the words address of your house that you had to tell your grandma? Is is that, I'm not sure I would particularly love it. But they said, come on, Jamie, like, stop being so British about this. Sweating is, we live in a hot country, it happens all the time. Um, it's a perfectly normal thing, and you need to get over your preconception of it being gross in some way, because it's not. So, you sort of understand those sorts of
Mm.
cultural nuances. Um, and then from the other way, I guess, I was working with a Hindi team a bit later on. And the sorts of words that they felt were too religiously charged,
Mm.
and sort of concepts that, to a non-Hindu, I
Yeah.
guess, wouldn't have even really ever occurred to me that they would have a religious meaning as well. But, they're words that are sort of imbibed with this spirituality that just made them not suitable for something like
Yeah.
the address of your front door.
Really, really
Uh,
interesting.
yeah, so we had to be really careful with every language
Yeah.
uh, to make sure that
Fascinating.
people, weren't going to find offence in it, I guess.
Yeah. Wow. What a job, Jamie. So cool. I'm so
It
cool.
was. And, the really interesting thing about it, I guess, well, one of the very interesting things about it was what I was saying earlier about the buy-in from the
Mm.
founders of the company, and they really understood, or they didn't just understand, they were the instigators of localizing the product as such an integral part of the history of the product, I guess.
Mm.
um, but because it's such a universal thing, you it isn't only the parts of the world where those big commercial opportunities are to be found where
Mm.
what the words is useful. So we were able to work in languages like Khmer or Lao, or Isikosa, Isizulu, 12 different languages that's spoken in India, all kinds
Yeah.
of things. Those kinds of languages that localize localization professionals don't often get to work
Yeah.
in, and are so fascinating in and of themselves, and have such interesting cultural connotations within their community. And I think,
Yeah.
to an extent, one thing that really shone out with me after working with over 3,000 probably speakers of 61 languages around the world, is how how intrinsically linked culture and cultural history is with language for so many people around the world, in a way
Yeah.
that actually I don't think, even me as a linguist, I don't think I have that same connection with my cultural heritage and being a native English speaker.
Mm. Mm.
Because you almost take it for granted as an English
Yeah.
speaker, because it's such a lingua franca of the world.
Yeah. I just think it leads me quite neatly to this, using language as a force for good. And it strikes me that what three words is such a great example of actually acknowledging that English isn't actually truly the lingua franca. We treat it as such, but I think there's probably 5% of the world's population for whom English is the first language, yet,
Yep.
you know, that's the language we use. That's the language in which most of the information is on the internet. And actually, it's weird because, especially because language and culture are so intrinsically linked, you feel like not all cultures are being represented equally because their languages aren't being represented equally, which is massive. And sometimes people say, if we all could just speak one language, it would be great. But actually, there's so much knowledge also that sits within other languages, and maybe languages that aren't spoken by, hundreds of thousands of people, that is really important to all of us. I was doing a lot of reading on indigenous languages and, people's activities and activism to bring indigenous languages back to life or keep them alive. And one thing that I hadn't really clocked, people have been researching this stuff for years, but for me, it hadn't really clicked, is the link between ecology and biodiversity and indigenous languages.
Yes.
It's something that I've only just really is kind of come into my sphere of consciousness, but there's so much knowledge, native knowledge about plants and animals and seasons and looking after the land that's part of the language. But if you don't have the language, if you lose the language, you actually then also lose the knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think anybody who is bilingual or even speaks another language to any sort of level, really, and I'm sure you can identify with this as well, is the perspective that you get on a particular situation when you're talking about it in one language compared to another. Your whole sort of understanding of a topic can change or flex maybe according to the language that you're discussing it in, right? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely.
And then when you're thinking about these languages where, so much of the construction of that language is based on, the natural world or talking about things that were important to those language communities, that maybe languages like English have lost with the sort of human evolution and revolution. But that knowledge, like you say, of the plants and the structure of the natural world, that's incredibly important information that, with language death, I think, you lose a culture, but you also lose so much embedded knowledge that, you're just never going to get back. So
Absolutely.
revitalizing those languages is so important. And finding opportunities, I think, for people to use those languages, like in the technological age, there are so few opportunities for speakers of very minority languages to use them online because people aren't creating content in them.
There are some really cool examples of actually people now using AI and large language models to train those on indigenous languages. So there's a radio station in New Zealand that has a whole website and a whole radio station all in the Maori language. It's really interesting. But even then, they're like, okay, but it's almost like they need to own that, right? They need to own, they own the language, they own the data. And I don't know, I guess I've read quite a lot of articles where then you'll have like big tech companies sweeping in and like paying like $10 to, a Maori native speaker and recording their voice and then using that technology that they've built and to then sell them that technology back to the native speaker who owns the language in the first place. And so there is a lot of discussion around that, of like respecting people's indigenous rights and their culture by not just trampling over it with bringing in technology that is not owned by them or they don't have any kind of righteous stake in it, if that makes sense. So yeah, sometimes I think technology can be fantastic for helping us to revitalize languages and encourage new language learners as the next generation comes up. But yeah, it's I feel like it's a path we need to tread carefully, right?
It has to be done in the right way, I think.
Yeah.
And it has to be done ethically, and it has to be done transparently,
Yeah.
and supported by the companies that have the technology, yes, but
Mm.
led by those language communities. I think that's so important, and
Yeah.
correct, uh, correctly remunerated as well.
Yeah,
That has to
absolutely.
be
There's actually a really nice example from Translators Without Borders, or Clear Global, as they're called as well,
yeah,
who they did a project together with a social enterprise in India, and the idea was to create a kind of a technology, like a hardware technology that would help Indian farmers in a remote Indian village to get up to speed on climate change, and essentially provide a way of sharing knowledge and raising awareness around climate change and how farmers can adapt to changing landscapes and weather systems and all of that. And so they came up with this box. Essentially, it's like a hardware box that, with using lots of really cool technology, they basically trained on the local Indian language that was spoken in that village. They plonked that box into a shop that was selling seeds, but was also an electronics shop. So because the local community said, well, this is where we go, this is where
yeah,
farmers go to get their grains and get their mobiles fixed, or whatever it is. And then they had to think about, okay, well, people might not read, right? They might only speak. So then they essentially made it a system where, using voice recognition, where they trained this box on lots and lots of questions around climate change, trained it in that language, and then people could come and press a button, ask a question, and they would receive an answer. And I think that's kind of a neat example of working with the local community, asking them what they need, rather than just assuming from like some sort of, office in Lisbon or New York, oh, what do people need, and actually make something for them and get the buy-in from that community. And hopefully in the long run, it means that farmers in that particular rural village in India are more clued up on climate change, and it helps them, move forward.
yeah, absolutely. That's a really cool example. And I think it's really important not to get overwhelmed with the enormity of the scale of the ask, really.
Mm,
There's what, 7,000-ish languages spoken in the world today,
yeah,
of which over half, I think, are endangered or at risk. Um, and yeah, so India's a really great example, right? It's got, testing my knowledge now, 22 scheduled languages, I think. But yeah. Um, but there's hundreds of other languages in India that aren't
yeah,
scheduled languages, like you were saying. And actually, this is important information for all of those languages community, for all those language communities to have.
mm,
Um, so replicating that project across all of the different communities, is a enormous project. But
yeah.
if there's one thing that's good at replicating stuff at scale, it's AI, right?
Yeah, it's very, very true. Yeah,
So,
absolutely. And this is coming back to using technology as a force for good, using language as a force for good. There's definitely, sometimes when I think back to my last few years in the translation world, commercial translation, this is right. And, I think the heaviness that a lot of translators have felt with the technology moving forward, machine translation and AI and all of that. And quite rightly being worried about their jobs in the future. And it's a very specific way of looking at your livelihood. And then you flip it on the other side and you look at all this other stuff that's going on in the world, right? The fact that people still don't have equitable access to language and information in their own language. And therefore, there's a massive digital skills gap that's getting wider and wider. So there's so much to do. Like, I feel like if you could take all of the linguists in the world and put them on these kinds kinds of projects. Like there's plenty of work to do to bring everyone up to a similar level in a more equitable world. But I guess that's not really how the world works, unfortunately.
No, I guess not. But you're right that that digital divide is only getting bigger. But also, I think, you know, the the hope in this is that actually, yes, the divide's getting bigger, but actually in very specific and niche ways, people are also narrowing that divide themselves. And they're doing projects and getting stuff out there on the internet
Mm.
and using technology to narrow that divide for their own communities,
Yeah,
stuff like, um, I think one of the top Wikipedia languages in terms of numbers of articles out there, I think Catalan is actually really high
oh
on the
wow.
list of number of Wikipedia articles available
Mm.
because that language community has very, um, very deliberately created that resource online.
Yeah.
So, when people have resources to use, that then just expands what people are able to do and
Mm.
that sort of thing. So I think it's really important. But making, if you have a product that it would be useful for other language communities to access, but they can't,
Mm.
making it available for speakers of that language is getting easier. And I think it's something that people should really take seriously and
Yeah,
feel that obligation to to do that, because if you try and put yourself in the shoes of somebody who is on the wrong side of the digital divide, it can be a very scary world.
absolutely. And I mean, even just moving to another country where you don't speak the language very well yet, like I'm in Portugal, and sometimes, trying to look at the government website to read about taxation or the financial year, all of that stuff. And I know this is a simple thing. And, yes, I can use DeepL or Google Translate to help me along with the words I don't understand. But it does feel crazy when, it's real when the struggle is real when you can't really access the information you need to fully participate in life and in society because there's a language barrier there.
And we've all come across it on holiday or traveling, like particularly, I think I feel particularly, is disenfranchised the right word? Um, when you're in a country where the language isn't even written in a writing script that you can
Yeah,
sound the letters out in. You're
absolutely.
looking at road signs and you think, I've
Mm.
got absolutely no way of knowing what that says.
Yeah.
Um, and having that experience every day of your life in your home country, trying
Mm.
to use resources, that must be a very lonely place. So I
Absolutely.
think,
And I think there is organizations there that trying to drive what is called linguistic justice. So this is basically a way where um, organizations are trying to equalize the access to the medical system, to voting, to everything that you need to participate properly in public life. And I think there's something there, isn't there, with colonialism as well that ties in with linguistic justice. And I printed something out I thought might be quite interesting just to read out. This is from the Tamarack Institute in Canada, and it says the importance of languages is not limited to their use as communication tools. Languages also structure the way we think. They enable us to invent, conceptualize, and concretize our ideas. By offering multiple perspectives, they play a key role in social and economic innovation, helping us to imagine and build diverse futures. Languages are also essential vehicles of knowledge, opening doors to various worldviews and distinct ways of existing, providing us with access to enriching insights to guide our decision making. and language justice movements seek to challenge the default dominance of the English language in order to broaden the participation of non-English or limited English speakers in all areas of public life.
Absolutely.
And that's, yeah, I guess, you know, when you do speak the dominant language in a country, you don't really think about it. And, you know, but for those who don't, it's a massive hurdle.
Yeah, it can be.
Yeah.
That's really bad.
I wanted to also ask you today, actually, I know we've been talking for almost an hour, but I really also wanted to ask you about your background. Because I guess what Three Words has been sort of the last 10 years of your life. But I was wondering if you maybe could share a little bit about what got you started in linguistics? What got you fired up about going into languages?
Good question. Sort of an unusual route, I guess. As a child, I had quite a bad stammer, which I manage much better now than I used to. I mean, you can still hear I have a speech impediment, but I manage it okay nowadays. I think I can generally get the words out that I want to get out in the right order. But you know, as a kid, just getting through one sentence sometimes simply wasn't possible. Just saying my own name out loud quite often wasn't possible. So,
Wow.
you know, meeting somebody for the first time, they would ask your name, and I would say, get really trying to get the j sound out, just couldn't do it. And people's first reaction, I think, maybe even more so in the 1980s than today, was, you know, to laugh or to, you know, sort of be like, oh, do you not even know your own name? What's wrong with you? And so I grew up really with communication, like particularly oral communication, being a real struggle, like something that was a source of anxiety rather than pleasure.
Yeah.
And sort of at the same time as this, I was finding that I really enjoyed learning languages. I was doing French at school from the age of 11, really enjoyed that. Didn't enjoy when we were in class and we were asked to say things out loud to the room, because I was not able to do that.
Yeah.
But I really enjoyed learning languages, and you know, all the things that we talked about today, how languages are constructed, what the cultural significance of languages is, how people use them. But like I also just really love the way that languages sound and the fact that each language has its own different sound. But I thought that languages and linguistics wasn't an avenue that was available to me.
Okay.
As a stammerer. But I guess was developing this real sort of understanding of the communication divide between people that find communication easy and people that don't. And that, I think, maps quite interestingly onto the digital divide of people that have access to particular resources and people that don't. People that you know, can use the internet and people that can't. And like really sort of, I'm very lucky to speak English and to have grown up in the UK and have a good level of education and, you know, all of the privileges that I have as that person. But I did understand what it is like to find communication hard, I guess.
Yeah. And I guess it kind of made you really aware of language and linguistics, I guess. It's, you know.
Yeah, exactly. You know, I remember as a child, I would pretty much every day, I would be having having a conversation with somebody and struggling to get my own sounds out of my mouth. And what I would be concentrating on, I would be really looking at the person that I was talking to, I'd be looking at their mouth, and I'd be looking at the shapes that their mouth was making, and sort of the fact that it was so easy, and they clearly weren't having to think about it. You know, they weren't
Yeah.
having to put their mouths into sort of contorted positions in order to get, you know, a
Yeah.
particular noise out. And just thinking, God, what is that like? Like, how 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 amazing to be able to speak and not have to actively think about
Yeah.
the physics of speaking. I got completely obsessed with it. Um, and I think that was partly behind my interest in other languages and sort of how languages speak and how it all
Yeah.
works physically as well. Um, and yeah, it was something that I was always very aware of.
Yeah.
Um, so then as an adult, I made a pretty rash decision um, to move to Brazil when I was 27.
Were you speaking Portuguese at that time or no? Love it. I think this is a theme in your life, Jamie, from what I know about you, is like you don't take the easy route. Like we'll come to this, but you've gone from someone who struggled at school with getting their words out to doing a TED talk. I mean, that's so impressive. So you going to Brazil without speaking a word of Portuguese doesn't surprise me in the slightest.
No, it was yeah. People call it brave. I think it's more along the stupid continuum, but there you go. Um, I I'm doing myself down a bit. I had learnt French and Spanish at school to a relatively good level, at least reading and writing, if not speaking. Um, and if you know, as an English speaker, if you know French and Spanish, it isn't a massive bridge
Mm.
over the water to Portuguese. But I didn't speak any Portuguese as yet. I didn't really have a plan. I didn't really know anybody there. I didn't have any money. Just got on a plane and went to Brazil.
As
um,
you do, as you do.
as you do, but I made it work, and I got a job in a language school. I thought I was going to get a job as an English teacher. Actually, I got a job as a receptionist, which is a great way to learn a language, to accidentally get a job when you have to use Portuguese every day.
Especially on the phone when you can't see people.
Exactly. Exactly. Um, by this time, you know, I was already starting to manage my stammer to an extent where I thought it would be difficult, but I could be an English teacher,
Mm.
or, you know, use language. Um, but actually, it was a real turning point because over that year that I lived in Brazil, I'm naturally good at languages. It's something that, you know, I find interesting and therefore can do because I need to be interested in order to be able to learn.
Yeah.
Um, and my Portuguese came on quite quickly, and I was able to have conversations pretty quickly. And people would compliment me on the level of my Portuguese, which, coming from a childhood where nobody had ever complimented me on being able to speak a language in my entire life, it was actually like that sort of confidence boost was actually a real
Yeah.
turning point in that learning to manage my stammer. And yeah, I came home from Brazil much more fluent than I'd left.
Wow.
Um, and then 28 coming back to the UK, I thought, okay, I've always been interested in languages. Now I feel like this industry might be something that can be for me as well.
Yeah.
So I did a master's in linguistics, and
Wow.
away we went, and here I am.
That's amazing. And if you don't mind me asking, what was I guess you had to do a dissertation for your master's. Do
I
you,
did, yeah.
what was it about?
Pretty niche. So my first degree was in classical music, because the kid who can't communicate orally with language, but wants to communicate with people. What do? They learn a musical instrument. So as a kid, I played the piano, played the clarinet, I composed music. So I went to undergrad to do music.
Okay.
I learned a lot about opera, which I was really interested in. The job that I had after university was as an opera company administrator,
Okay.
which was really cool. Pre-Brazil, this was. So then
Yeah.
post-Brazil, when I was doing the linguistics masters, my dissertation was in the translation of opera libretti.
Oh.
Because there's two main ways you can do it. Um, if you've ever been to the opera, you'll know that quite often usually above the stage, there's like a text box, for want of a better word, where they project the translations of the Italian or whichever language opera is happening on stage. So you can sort of read along. It's a little bit like having subtitles on TV.
Oh, wow.
But they call it surtitles because it's above the stage, not below.
Ah, very clever.
So that's one way that you translate opera. And the other way, which is something that English National Opera do a lot, is actually translate the libretto itself. So you'll get Mozart opera in Italian, and you'll get somebody to translate the Italian into English so that the characters are singing English themselves.
Oh, wow.
Which is quite a niche and difficult thing for a translator to do, because it requires both linguistic expertise but also understanding of singing and what's possible singing. And like if a soprano is singing very high, there's particular sounds that she's not going to be able to make because particular linguistic sounds that you can't create up there.
You can't really go on a plosive, right?
No, you can't plosive. Like, but also with vowel sounds, you can't make an e sound at the very top of your register. So a translator of libretti has to know and understand that and understand the physics and all that sort of thing, and also be a poet and write something that's going to sound nice, and quite often that has to rhyme, and all these other things that you don't have to think about usually.
It's a very, very particular skill. The closest thing I can think of is like dubbing, like in Germany. I grew up in a country where all the foreign movies are dubbed into German. So you imagine you see an American or English actor in the movie, and then the dubbed version has to be translated so the meaning is the same, but then also they have to use the same vowels and plosive sounds roughly in the same place. So you're not hearing p when the actor's saying oh with their mouth open. So it's like it's a specialist skill. But even worse in opera, I imagine, even more skill.
Yeah, I'd never quite drawn that link actually, but of course, I mean, it makes complete sense. It's really interesting.
Yeah, it's actually weird when it's like I came to England for like an internship, and then I'd watched Friends, the series, for the first time in the original. Blew my mind how different the voices were, and then went back to Germany. It's like I just couldn't watch it anymore because all of a sudden I had that memory, but also I could now see that the speech wasn't quite the same as the mouths of the actors. So it just completely ruined German television for me. So bit of a strange one. But yeah, definitely a massive skill to do that well.
Yeah. Wow. So that was my master's. And then I thought, cool. I was going to be a opera translator.
Yeah.
Which isn't. I mean, there's not many of those in the world. But I thought that was what I could do. But then landed at Worthy Words instead. So
that's incredible. And then, yeah, I do want to come back to your TED talk because I think it absolutely blows my mind that, you know, you kind of to think of your journey through life like that. So yeah, why wouldn't I stand on stage in front of people and memorize a speech and you know, speak it out loud? So I mean, could you share a little bit about what that was like to do a TED talk and get up on stage there?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a TEDx in Kingston in London.
Hmm.
Um, I was invited to talk. They first invited me, as with almost every other important event in my life, it was scheduled for 2020 and got cancelled. That was the year that I was going to have a big 40th birthday, get married, and move house as well, and none of those things. Um, but anyway, we digress. It was it was rescheduled for, I think, 2022, and they wanted me to talk about what three words, and I was assigned this amazing speech coach called Tara Majumdar, who I had lots of sessions with, you know, crafting what I was going to talk about. And actually, as I assume happens quite often, the thing that I ended up talking about was not the thing that I originally intended to talk about.
Okay.
You know, because she was, you know, talking about what makes a good speech and what's the audience's connection with the human being that is doing the talking, not
Mm,
necessarily the subject, because anybody can, you know, talk about a subject.
mm.
And, you know, she said to me, I remember one meeting we had in a John Lewis cafe in Kingston, and she said, um, what's your talk about? And I said, languages are what three words. And she said, and why are you talking to us about this? And I said, because I'm head of languages at what three words. And she said, no, no, no. Why are you, Jamie Brown, talking to us about this? And I said,
Okay.
because I'm head of languages at what three words. And she said, no, 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 no. Try again. Um, and you know, that was the first time that the penny dropped with me that I am a linguist because I grew up with a stammer.
Mm.
I'd never made the connection between those two things before. Um, so, firstly, that's something that I will be eternally grateful to Tara for
Yeah.
for sort of helping me, you know, to realize and to communicate, but also to come to terms with, I guess, in a way.
Yeah.
Um, but that talk about the the what three words languages became what three words languages, growing up with a stammer, what having a like what having a stammer means, that your perspective on language is, and how people use languages and what
Mm,
words are, and the fact that actually, um, being able to do that, whether it's, you know, because you've had trouble speaking, or if it's because you don't have access to to materials in the right language,
yeah.
being able to use words and to construct them into speech or text is, it's a real privilege, and it's not a privilege that everybody has.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, I found that that realization was actually really powerful. And, you know, people said, oh gosh, were you not nervous getting up on stage in front of 800 people and speaking for 20 minutes? And my goodness,
800
you.
people. Getting sweaty just thinking about that.
I know, right?
Sweaty. I'm sorry, it's a trigger word.
Yeah. You know, like, growing up with a stammer, was that not really triggering for you to have to do
Yeah.
that? And I said, actually, no, not at all. Like, it simply felt like a privilege that I was able to do it
Mm,
because of the journey that I had been through in order to get to that place.
Yeah.
And, the people that had been instrumental in helping me to do that,
Mm.
like the, um, I, yeah, from teachers at school to people who complimented my Portuguese to, so many people take somebody on that process,
Yeah.
particularly when it's something that you start not being able to do at
Yeah.
all, really. Um, and I thought, yeah, no, it was a privilege to be able to do it. So no, I wasn't nervous. Um, and yeah, without getting too schmaltzy, I guess, um, like if I am able to be a person on that journey for somebody who doesn't have language access,
Mm.
getting language access and being able to do things in their native language in the way that I can,
Yeah.
um, do a TED talk. I mean, who knew, if you'd have known me at 12 years old that I was going to do a TED talk 30 years and later, you'd have
Yeah.
laughed in my face. Um, but it is possible, and it takes away the anxiety, I think. So public
Yeah.
speaking for me is um, not something to get nervous about. It's something to embrace and to just really enjoy the fact that I'm able to do it, I guess.
That's amazing. And I mean, I watched it back just last week in preparation for our recording today, and it's a beautifully structured talk, very interesting, very personal. I think it does that makes it that connection, but also like from a public speaking perspective, just so well paced, and you're calm and you make jokes, and like I just think it's so impressive, even if you didn't grow up with a stammer. Like, I think it was a really good TED talk, just incredible, like a great lesson in how to give a public talk. And
Really
now
fun.
I guess you still seek out those public speaking opportunities, don't you?
Oh yeah, always. Whenever I can, I'm always putting
Mm.
myself up for speaking in public.
Yeah.
I think if you're able to get over the anxiety that so many people very legitimately feel on public speaking,
Yeah.
and it's a great thing to be able to do. That act of communication and idea sharing, I think, is something that is really powerful.
Yeah.
Um, and I think it's interesting, actually, you say about the pacing of language. I think somebody who has grown up with a stammer actually has a bit of a secret weapon there, because we have had to think about pacing of language our entire lives.
Mm.
There's particular sounds that are going to be problematic. And so, there's tips and tricks to slow down or speed up or find another way to get over that noise that you're going to have trouble physically reproducing.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, like the vocabulary that you have to learn as a stammerer, to have other options if there's a word that you can't say is actually, um, I really do genuinely look at it now as a blessing, not a curse, because I
Yeah.
think sort of made me the linguist I am, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess public speaking is the one side, but I know you also really love writing, and you now do that as a profession. I was just wondering sort of what kind of stuff you write for your clients, what you sort of get involved with, and if there's anything maybe that you particularly enjoy, a kind of writing or kind of content you like to write on.
Yeah, no, it's really good. I do. I've always loved writing, um, and I've always written, but never professionally up until quite recently.
Mm.
But I went freelance a couple of years ago and took the opportunity to be a localization consultant, which was the idea behind going freelance. Um, but also having more time to do my own writing,
Mm.
and writing for clients. It's been really cool. Um, so writing creatively has been really interesting. I've worked with a few clients on, um, again, using my classical music background to do um, listings copy and program notes for classical musicians and classical music organizations. I've done some editing, so I know quite a lot of Kazakh linguists through having worked on the Kazakh version of What Three Words. I was asked to edit some English translations of Kazakh fairy tales.
Wow, that's so cool.
Which is really cool. And so, sort of learning something about a culture that you wouldn't really have otherwise had access to was really interesting. And actually, children's literature is something that I'm particularly interested in anyway. So that was really cool. And then also
Fabulous.
more technical writing. So I've worked with some clients doing like proposal writing,
Yeah, yeah,
which has been really interesting. And what's quite nice about that is that one of the main things you have to do as a freelance bid writer is to go into a new company, and you may or may not have any technical expertise on what that company does, but helping them to craft an engaging and persuasive tender response in a topic that isn't your expertise is actually a really interesting thing to do. So, interviewing subject matter experts within that company and, understanding what the tender is asking you to do and,
yeah,
understanding about structuring language and being persuasive within language is actually a skill that I found out that I had, and also a skill that, lots of other people report that they don't have. So,
yeah,
you're finding stuff up, finding stuff out about yourself that my background in localization, which is exactly that, isn't it? It's taking stuff from one language to another, helps my own writing and bid writing, and where I'm translating what a subject matter expert is telling me into
yeah,
language that is appropriate for a proposal,
yeah. I love
which
that.
is really cool. You see those little similarities between the
Yeah,
language work that you do, and language is so pervasive that if you look hard enough, there's applications for linguists and writers and all those sorts of professions to get involved in
yeah.
stuff that they may not have really realized was for them.
Yeah, absolutely. I loved
Yeah.
it's one thing I loved about translation actually is that sort of every project you do, you kind of learn something new because every client, it's a new product or a new thing or whatever. So it feels like you never stop learning. And I imagine with bid writing, going to into a company must be really fascinating just to wrap your head around a completely different industry, a different processes, and yeah. But it's a real thing. It's a real skill to communicate the essence of something that you learn about, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I've worked quite a lot with a big live events agency here in the UK on proposal writing. Um, didn't know a single thing about how to put on a event for 60,000 people in a big open, central London open environment before. I had absolutely not a clue about that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Um, but now, what don't I know about uh, crowd management within Trafalgar Square?
I love that. But I do
So,
think as a
yeah.
writer, you come in with a fresh perspective as well, because they probably think, oh, everyone would know this, but actually, the people reading the proposal might not know certain things, or, it's not as obvious to them. So having that fresh perspective from a writer coming in can be really helpful as well, I imagine.
Yeah, and what is really freeing is not being the subject matter expert.
Mm,
So you can ask what on the face of it is a really silly question
yeah.
without any um without any fear of looking stupid.
Yeah.
because you're not expected to know, because you're not, I'm not an events professional. So of course I don't know this particular thing about crowd movement. Um, so
Yeah.
yeah, that's really nice to be able to ask those questions and to really dig down. And like you say, quite often it sets off a chain of questions that then, the subject matter experts look at something slightly differently, or sort of asking themselves a slightly different question to the one that they asked 20 minutes ago.
Yeah.
Um, so it can be quite a nice sort of learning curve as well.
Amazing. And do you have like a particular process for writing? Something that you kind of follow regardless of what the type of content is or the kind of writing that you do?
Yes. Um, Almost without exception, I would say my writing style is splurge as much as you can on a page and then totally rewrite it.
Yeah, I know about that one. That's what I do. It's like write 1,500 words and then edit it
Yeah,
down to like one sentence that's usable.
yeah, yeah. And like once there's something on the page, you can change
Mm.
it. I think the most sort of restricting thing for me would be trying to get it right first time.
Yeah.
And
Okay. I think that's something that I've learned from just starting to write some articles for the Humane Language Substack. Just get started sometimes. Don't worry that the first draft is not going to be what you publish, and just allow yourself the freedom to kind of have that flow of consciousness, get it out of your head onto the page, and then you can still kind of
yeah,
mess with it and massage it. And
yeah, and it's thinking time, isn't it, as well? I think something I've always had a bit of a sort of niche passion for is studies that famous artists have made for
Mhm.
pictures that we all know and recognize. And you can see sort of little sketches they've done that, turn into bigger famous works, or, little sort of almost just like color palettes of sort of how the colors fit together, or, um, yeah, I always think those things like the building blocks are really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's really valuable thinking time for those artists in the way that for a writer, V1 is valuable thinking time, and actually, only a few percent of it may actually end up in the end result, but it
Yeah.
was all worthwhile.
And this is why it's so important for freelance writers to properly charge, right? And not just charge for the words on the page, but actually it's all that stuff that goes on in the background, all that intellectual thinking whilst you're walking the dog or you're in the shower, or, it all, yeah, it all adds up actually. When you sometimes think, when I think about how long it took me to write one article, I'm like, whoa, that's surely not commercially viable. But it's about, charging for your, not just for your time, but for all the expertise you hold in your head and the skill of, like you say, bringing out the information in a way that helps engage the reader as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Amazing. Well, listen, I feel like we probably could go on for hours talking about our favorite topics, but I just wanted to thank you so much for joining me today. What I will do is I will share the link to your website, to your professional website, and the link to your TED Talk as well in the show notes, so people can go and check you out. And yeah, thank you so much for joining me, Jamie. It's been a pleasure.
It was absolutely marvelous. Loved every minute of it. Thanks, Anya.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.